Greetings, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast, the podcast that I always wanted to listen to but could never find, so I just decided to start it myself, and that was over 5 years ago. So welcome in, everybody. Thank you for joining me on this journey, whether you are a regular listener or perhaps a newbie. Welcome in. Happy to have you with us as well. There are, however, certain people who deserve extra welcoming in status, and those, of course, are my VIP listeners, the very important pickers. And today's VIP of the show is Fred Kinch. Fred is a new student at age 55, and he is already incorporating the right and left hand boot camps into his practice routine. So, Fred, thank you so much for your generous support, and I'm happy to know that you are including the podcast exercises as part of your balanced banjo breakfast. And for those of you unaware, the way to achieve this elite VIP status for podcast listeners is you head over to patreon.com/banjopodcast. You throw me a couple bucks a month. There are amazing rewards to be had in exchange. And that's all in addition to the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping support the little banjo podcast that could. So one more time, that's patreon.com/banjopodcast, and thank you once again to today's VIP, Fred Kinch. I also couldn't do this show without the support of my amazing sponsors, Sullivan Banjos, Elderly Instruments, and Peghead Nation. You'll hear more about them later. Other exciting news from Picky Fingers HQ, there is a clearance sale, 23% off of everything in the official Picky Fingers merchandise store. That's those official Picky Fingers logo t-shirts, the stickers, and also the music downloads, the intro and outro theme music for this podcast, along with Banjo tablature. You can get anything there at 23% off by entering coupon code SUMMER23, that's all one word, at checkout. And to find that, you go to banjopodcast.com, navigate to the store there, add a bunch of items to your cart. Of course, sizes and colors will be somewhat limited. This is, after all, a clearance sale before I restock going into the fall. So yeah, once again, banjopodcast.com, and enter SUMMER23 at checkout to get 23% off your entire order. Along those same lines, I will be restocking merch, so if anybody has some cool new merchandise idea of something that you have been dying to purchase with the Picky Fingers logo on it, shoot me a note. That's at pickyfingersbanjopodcast@gmail.com. You can also email me with any other questions, comments, or concerns. Today's episode is a slightly different style of episode from my usual interviews. I'm calling this one the Masters of the Five-String Banjo Revisited episode, featuring Tony Trischka and Pete Wernick, who are the two authors of this hopefully well-known book. I never miss an opportunity to highly recommend this book to people. Now, unfortunately, it is out of print, so it might be tough to find those copies. But in terms of banjo resources, this is one of the best ones out there, and really had a huge impact on me personally, and was an inspiration for me doing this podcast, because it was, well, chock full of banjo players interviewing other banjo players about really nerdy, in-depth banjo stuff. So if that reminds you of this podcast, that is not by accident. I took a huge influence from that book. And when I found myself at Midwest Banjo Camp about a month ago, along with Tony Trischka and Pete Wernick, who have both been interviewed individually on the show, I figured that was a great opportunity to get together with them and discuss the making of this book. And they were, of course, very generous with their time to sit with me to do just that. So give a warm Picky Fingers welcome to Tony Trischka and Pete Wernick. Let's get started. It's a real pleasure running into you guys. I think I've probably told you both, maybe on separate occasions, but if you've forgotten, then let me express once more my gratitude that you put in so much work on this book. It's definitely been an inspiration on what I'm doing with the podcast. I loved it from the moment I saw it, and I've read it cover to cover a few times. So it's an honor to speak with you both about it. I don't think any treatise like this exists for maybe any other discipline that I know of. So that makes me curious. How is it that this exists for us lucky banjo players?
I actually happen to have a letter that I proposed just such a thing to Music Sales, where I had a couple of successful books. And Tony had, he got started doing stuff for them too.
Thanks to Pete.
Yeah, I recommended him when they were after me to do yet another book. And I thought, I was doing so well with the first two. And I was a big Tony Trischka fan, still am. And this was me doing good deeds for my buds to help them along in their early careers. And so they asked me to do melodic banjo, and I sent him to Tony, and he did a fine job and so on. And then I thought, there is a book I'd like to do. I'd like to interview all these guys. And I wrote him a proposal, and nothing happened, just nothing. And I didn't care. I wasn't that hot to do it, but I didn't care. But then Tony... you did some interviews in another book.
In my banjo songbook.
Yeah.
And in the melodic banjo book, too.
Yeah, and it was wonderful to see him there. You get to hear what they say about it. It's not just a bunch of numbers on lines.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think banjo players have no personality. Would you agree?
I agree we have no personality. Is that what you're saying? I'm not sure.
Well, the
people
joke
are
about
onto it. Yeah.
What do the banjo players use for birth control? And it's their personality.
Yeah.
Well, when you watch us play, because, Earl, as a young boy, he would, when he first started playing with people, he was playing along by himself. He could play a tune as many times as he wanted. But when he started playing with people, he noticed these guys looking real dour and just kind of, and Earl was thinking, well, you should be smiling, when you're playing. And if you see him in, videos with the Martha White shows, he's always looking out at the camera with a little bit of a smile. So he had a personality. Don Reno would do the same thing. But most
Don
of us,
was amazing.
Yeah, Ralph exuded smile. Okay, maybe not. But, it was one of my favorite banjo
I remember
players,
seeing people walk in front of the stage of Newgrass Revival in front of Bela, and this won't work so good on radio, but they would hold up the corners of their mouths to say, like, come on, smile already. And he was concentrating. Come on, he's doing everything
that stuff
imaginable.
isn't easy.
He's being Bela Fleck. You can't.
Right.
Well, it's funny, though. You see
so
Jens
amazingly.
Kruger, I just saw him on TV, and he's like filled with joy as he's doing this most incredible, complicated stuff, and he's kind of laughing about it, and he doesn't miss a note. I mean, and we admire that,
Yeah. Seeing Johnny Bear last night really struck me as a throwback to that kind of showmanship. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to say hamming it up because it's not like it's not authentic. He's really enjoying himself.
Yeah.
But it's just that little
He's
extra
selling it.
awareness of
That's called selling it.
presentation.
Yeah, but that's what Earl did, and that's what, and there was the show. It was an idea of the show.
There's also 3 banjo players. When people talk about smiling banjo players, I can say there's 3. Shall we name them?
Well, Alan Shelton's one of them.
One of them, and Roy Clark,
Yeah, Roy Clark.
who's not in the bluegrass world, but smiled like crazy on Hee Haw. And
Little Roy?
yes, but I wasn't thinking of him. That makes 4. Doug Dillard.
Oh, yeah, Doug Dillard was, yeah.
Huge
you're right.
grin, wouldn't stop grinning. Everybody else, too busy, I'm busy, sorry. you know. Anyway, so we both got into the idea of doing interviews, and I had been a radio person. I had done quite a few interviews, interviewed Don Reno, in fact, at the first Bluegrass Festival, and I enjoyed doing interviews, and there's a bit of a technique to it, as you're well aware, especially for people who are not used to being, verbal for audiences as much as just playing the music. And I found that if you just got relaxed with them a little bit and asked a few of the standard questions just to let them get started, and then you showed some specific interest in something that they did that not everybody knows about, then now you get into their circle a little bit, and then it's important to just let them talk and see if they'll get going. And if they don't, you can still kick them along a little bit. So I got long conversations out of Ralph Stanley, J.D. Crowe, who's more talkative than most was more talkative than most people would have guessed. And we went from, we got the agreement. Should we say Jason's full name? He was the guy.
It's in the book.
Jason Schulman.
That's right.
Yeah.
Jason Schulman.
Yeah.
And he was good enough to say, yeah, let's try for this. And we were a little scared, both of us. I think you could remember this, that like, this might get pretty long. You know, we wanted to interview like 16 or 18 players. It turned out to be 18, something like that anyway. And I was just worried. I thought, oh, they're going to edit it all over the place and it won't really be that good. And cutting to the chase, they didn't edit anything. We put in like everything except the ho-hum stuff. And there was a ton of it. The book is 430 pages.
Yeah.
So we got started on it. And right away you interviewed Don Reno, and then he died.
Got there just in time. Yeah.
Just in time.
Incredible.
And that way we got everybody who was really significant in the bluegrass banjo world, except Earl Scruggs. Now, I was pretty friendly with Earl. And I said, we can't, would you be interviewed? He said, no, I don't want to be interviewed. And I went, we can't have a book like this without a big chapter on you. Mm-hmm. And I proposed to him that I would write a whole big chapter and I would let him see it and make any changes. He was very agreeable to that. And I came to realize that he was not very pleased with the way he could talk about the banjo. Mm-hmm. In private, he had a lot to say about musicianship and whatnot, and we'd have wonderful conversations like that. But he was just not the kind of guy who wanted to get quoted much. And I remember reading about how when he was starting to play, all the players in North Carolina were playing herky-jerky. And he didn't want to play herky-jerky. And I'm thinking, yeah, that wouldn't read so well. I read it in an interview, and then I came to realize that was the way he wanted it. But he had been writing, they were ghost-written articles in Pickin' Magazine that I'm sure were done with his cooperation. And he had a lot to say in these Pickin' Magazine articles. And you just, when you have such a central figure like that, you
have to make it work somehow.
And I was very heartened that he let me write this chapter. And then he okayed the chapter with a couple of small things that might make interesting conversation later. And we want to include a lot of tablature, but we couldn't get permission to almost anything because it's owned by the rival publisher, Peer International. But we were able to get Foggy Mountain Special, which was great, except... Do you remember?
No.
He didn't want us to use it.
Okay.
He let it be known that he didn't want
right.
Foggy Mountain Special in there. So there are tabs of that tune, which is one of his most brilliant tunes, but they're not authorized by him in any way. And for whatever that's worth. But we had to sit there and figure out who to put in the book, and that was an ordeal.
Well, yeah, we will definitely get to that. I know that was probably the most contentious aspect of this from having talked to both of you about it. But to
not
back
between
up
us,
right?
No, we had no words about that.
Well, that I remember anyway.
There was that knife fight, but we're over that.
So to back up, you conceived it as interviews. It of course ended up being. You already said there's tablature, but there's a lot more than just the interviews. When did it start being this snowball that and this would be cool and that would be cool and we should do this too? And
I mean, I think the main thing that's, besides all the interviews, which are of course important, I'll just say one thing about the interviews. The one that stands out in my mind is interviewing Bill Monroe, me anyway, because we decided we'll both interview Bill Monroe.
Okay.
And so I was playing with this band, I was in Skyline. And we were out at some festival south of Chicago or something. And I was friendly with Bill Monroe's bass player, Mark Hembry, at the time, who has a wonderful book out now called 5 Years on the Bus, telling all these stories.
On the Bus with Bill Monroe, I believe is the exact title.
Is that what it is? 5 Years on the Bus with Bill Monroe? Anyway, so I went up to Mark and said, would this be a good time to interview Bill? And he said, yeah, well, why don't you go on and try now? So I get on the bus, and there are the four new Coon Creek girls, on either side of Bill, and he's just as happy as a pig, and
Oh, no.
and there are these three pies stacked up in boxes on the table in front of him. And before I could say anything, he just said, "Would you like a pie?" And I didn't know what the correct answer was, and I went, "No, thanks." And I figured this probably isn't a good time so I just left the bus. and then asked Mark again, maybe half an hour before the show, when should I do this? Why don't you go on now? So I go on now, and Bill was very jolly when I went on the first time, needless to say. I come on the second time about half an hour before he's going on stage, and he comes from the back where his bedroom is. He has his big bed back there, and he's fixing his tie. And I said, Bill, is this a good time for me to do an interview? And he said, that'd be fine. And then I sit down with him, and then I say, so Bill, what part would you say the banjos had in your music? And he said, it had its place. This dead airspace here is what happened. And, he looked out into infinity to some spot out, in the cosmos. And okay, now what about, when Earl Scruggs joined the band? That really helped your music, didn't it, in some ways? And he said, I taught him the blues.
Tony is now looking out to the infinity space
for
those of you not watching
space
on TV.
It was a really something to that effect. I mean, if you have the book, you can look at it. It may not have been exactly that, but it was pretty close to that kind of a thing. It was a really awkward conversation. Maybe I should have taken a tip from you, Pete, because I'd done many interviews at that point, but this was the toughest one I ever had to do.
I had a number of times where I interviewed Bill, and he was a tough cookie at times. Mm-hmm. In fact, I have a horrible tape recording of myself trying to get him to talk in an interview on the phone, which I found out later was a no-no, but I didn't know. I was in New York and he was in Nashville. After about 8 tries, he comes to the phone, and I say, I'm writing a book about bluegrass singing, and of course I have to interview you. You're the father of bluegrass and all that. And so I said, well, what is special about bluegrass singing? And then we have about 8 seconds of silence. And he says, how much do you know about bluegrass? And by this time I'm blubbering because I am more uncomfortable than you can imagine. Yeah. And I said, well, I just really want an interview. Blah, blah, blah. And then he says, well, I'm kind of busy right now. Why don't you call me tomorrow night? I said, oh, okay, what time? He says, 3:00. And I go, 3:00 at night? And he's already hung up. I had already interviewed him for a whole hour with the 1966 version of the band when I had a radio show in New York City, and David Grissman arranged for us to do a full hour up at Ralph Rinsler's apartment. And I still have a fantastic tape of this hour-long program. And I interviewed Bill, and one of the things I did was say, well, when you started bluegrass in 1945, and right away he said, no, that's when Lester and Earl were in my band, but bluegrass started in 1939. We added the banjo. He might not have even mentioned Scruggs, which was another little feature of the way he talked about the banjo in general. And he told what was good about, they don't need no hot guitar, don't need no dobro, various things that later became standard in bluegrass. But otherwise, he was nice. He had actually called me up once when I was on the air, which amazed me that he would call me up. Yeah. But I had just plugged a bunch of his shows, and he was at Tex Logan's house, and he called me up. But then I interviewed him other times when he had the time, and he was completely nice. He would call me Pete in the interview, which is the only time he ever used my name ever. And I interviewed him several times. I have hours of interviews with him. But the one that I remember the most really is the one I did on the banjo. And I don't even remember where that one was, but it was a long interview, and he was with it okay. And then I realized what I could and couldn't ask him. And there's so much I could say about it, but some of the most interesting things was that he refused to acknowledge Earl Scruggs. He called the style of banjo Snuffy Jenkins style. Uh-huh. And then he talked about then people came along like Brad Keith that could really play the melody, and he was very happy about that. And he talked nicely about Bill Keith. And at one point when Scruggs came up in the conversation, he says, there's no telling how much good Molly and Tenbrook's done for Earl Scruggs, meaning he gave him the material that he could use his style on. Right. And if it wasn't for that, Earl Scruggs, he said, he would have just had to go back to the farm in North Carolina, but I gave him something to do and worked out good for him. And that's about as much as he wanted to say until very late in the interview. He said Earl at the time was home all the time because he had a bad back and he couldn't go on the road. He says, it's too bad that Earl doesn't go out more. He says, Earl done good for Molly and Ten Brooks, too. And I thought, he knows how to be charitable.
Made a
how great.
concession. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, anyway.
My favorite recollection of the Bill Monroe interview, and I guess given that it sounds like it was a composite between both of you discussing, so I don't know which of you had this conversation. There was something about he wants to play fiddle tunes the way the guy that wrote it
that was
intended
my
it
interview.
To be. And
I like telling that story. He says, the banjo player needs to play the tune the way it was wrote.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, how do you know, who wrote Katie Hill? And I thought that was an ancient tune. He says, no, that would be Clayton McMitchin and people like that. And I said, so I went back. I said, how about Arkansas Traveler? How do you know how that guy played it when he made it up? He said, if anybody in the world could hear me playing Arkansas Traveler, they'd know I was playing it right. and I thought,
round and round
it's
we go.
Amazing to be so confident.
Yeah.
What a thing, And Butch Robbins, in his book, which is a fascinating book, said, if Bill didn't like the way the sun came up that morning, he'd tell you how the sun should have come up. So that was just interesting to hear the guy that basically enabled bluegrass banjo to hit the scene. Because if he hadn't hired Earl, well, he would have ended up with Don Reno. Everybody kind of knows that story, that he had asked Don Reno, who went into the service instead. And then Reno ended up playing later with Monroe, but he never recorded much with him. And
but he never officially recorded with them.
That's right. He's not on any official release by Columbia Records or whatever they were on.
But if you go to YouTube and put in Don Reno and Bill Monroe, there's like an hour's worth of transcripts from the Opry.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Just like all the stuff with Flattened Scruggs, but there's also Reno stuff.
I didn't realize.
Where he does White House Blues, and he used to tell me this, that sometimes he'd take a solo on a tune, and the entire solo would just be forward rolls, nothing but forward rolls. And he does one of the solos on White House Blues like that.
McKinley, I hollered, McKinley's called. I said, McKinley, I can't find the soul. Found a dime, found a dime. Doc told a horse to slow down his rein. He said to the horse, you got to out from the train. Buffalo to Washington. Doc come a run, he took off his hat. He said, you found a time, you found a time.
This would have been 48 or 49, right?
Yeah.
Before.
When we were kind of young.
I was alive in 49.
Well,
anyway,
so luckily, Tony interviewed Don Reno, and that was great because Don's a friendly guy, and he was very agreeable, and I was glad that all of these people realized it was worth spending the time with us.
An opportunity. Yeah.
Nobody gave us a one-word answer kind of interview, although it felt like it was going to be like that with Ralph Stanley, but he opened up. But a lot of these guys really didn't have a whole lot to say verbally about it. They would just soon you listen to the music, and that's the message, is just listen, And Ralph was really as much interested in his singing and the band singing as he was with his own banjo playing. And he was in the shadow of Earl Scruggs at the time, but he worshipped Earl, and he was fabulous. And if you listen to some of the stuff he was doing in the 70s with some of his great bands then, he was on fire, that guy. And by that time, Earl had kind of slowed down, and he wasn't as brilliant as he had previously been. But Ralph was playing really fast and just fabulous, and he had this incredible band. And anyway, but what happened was that as we were on the telephone, little Ralph, too, would come on the phone. He was 6 years old at the time. He's like in his 40s now, I guess. And he was just being a wise-ass little kid. Mm-hmm. And Ralph kept telling him to get off the phone. So that was entertaining. And I don't know, do you have any other highlights of the interviews you did?
Snuffy Jenkins.
Yeah,
I liked that a lot.
Yeah, that's amazing that you were...
Yeah, I'd interviewed him for the my Banjo songbook before that, but I interviewed him again for this. And I was invited to play with a group called the Violent Femmes, who are not violent and they're guys. But I got friendly with them, and I was on one of their songs on one of their records called the Country Death Song, but that's another story. And so they had like a very punk, kind of crowd that they played for with tattoos. Well, everyone has tattoos these days, but back then fewer. And mohawk haircuts and piercings and, this whole thing. And me and my friend Barry Mitterhoff were going to sit in with them, and I think we were supposed to start at midnight or something like that. And the sound check was 7:00. So we do the sound check, and then Barry and I decided, well, what are we going to do? Let's see a movie. So we opened up the New York Post, which is even better than the New York Times. Well, maybe not. But anyway, you open it up, and we're looking through the movies, and then suddenly there's a picture of Snuffy Jenkins and Pappy Sherrill, who was his musical
in the New York Times. Oh no, in the New York
Post. And it was it just happened to be there. They were playing that night at 8:00, and by this time, I think it was 8:00 already. And and it's downtown on White Street in Manhattan, wherever that is. And there was no GPS in these days, so we hailed a cab. We got to get to White Street. I don't know where it is, and they drove off. We literally found 6 cabs.
Take me to Snuffy Jenkins. Oh, no problem.
Oh, yeah. Why didn't you say that in the first place, like Santa Claus? Anyway, after 6 tries, we finally found someone who knew White Street, or they found it in their map book, whatever. They take us to White Street, and it's like 9:15. We figured, we probably missed Snuffy and Pappy, because I think there was someone else on the bill, and they're probably headlining, whatever. So we get down there. They haven't started yet. So we got to see Snuffy. I'd never seen him play live before, and it was just a great show. And he played washboard as well as banjo. Yeah, and had the funny hat on, and it was just fantastic. And at the end of the show, I went up to him and said, "Snuffy, I interviewed you for this other book, but I'd love to interview you for this new book I'm doing." And he said, "I don't have anything to say. It'd be like not unfriendly, but it'd be the same as talking to yourself." And I said, "Well, I don't mind talking to myself, so can we do this?" And it turned out that Pappy and the other people, and there was some young guitar player playing with them, they were going to go sightseeing in New York the next day, but Pappy was a tiny bit under. He said, "I'm a little under the weather. I'm just going to stay in the hotel, and why don't you come by tomorrow?" So I did, and there he is. And there's his banjo on the bed. And, I interviewed him for a while and talked to him about how, they would go to fiddle contests together, he and Earl, and this sort of thing. And I asked him, I knew he'd played Dear Old Dixie in the past. He'd said that, and I asked him, "Would you play Dear Old Dixie?" And I'm recording this. And he played, my banjo's over there, but he played it similar to what Earl did, but different, some cool stuff. He was tuned up in A, like G tuning up in A, without a capo. He just had it tuned sharp by a whole step. I remember that now. Mm-hmm. And he played that, and then I said, "Could you play Sally Gooden?" And he played Sally Gooden almost exactly like Earl did. Very, that same position. And I had asked Earl in an interview where he got that position. He said he didn't remember. But just sidebar, because I'd just been thinking about this, and I looked back at my banjo songbook, and I just wanted to see what Snuffy said there. And in there, he says that he got that position from Smith Hammett and Rex Brooks, who were the 2 banjo players around Flint Hill back when Earl was growing up. And Snuffy heard them, and he said that's where he got it from. And it was like, even I mentioned it today to somebody, to one of the classes. And I think it's so cool to know that it at least goes that far back.
It's a web of stuff, not just
that position did not start with Earl or Snuffy, but these 2 guys who were around in those days. And where did they get it from? Yeah, just to finish. So I just asked Snuffy, can I try your banjo? He said, "Sure." And it's the banjo that has a pickguard on it. Mm-hmm. And it's a pre-war flathead. Yeah. And so, I started playing it. It sounded so amazing because you're not touching the head and killing the vibrations on the head. And it just sang. It was like, "Can I have this, Snuffy?" No. Anyway, so it was a wonderful experience interviewing him.
Let's go back to what we alluded to before, the actual selection process, or even further back. What were you hoping to get out of these people? Was there like a main
everything
essence that you wanted to?
We were just basically 2 banjo geeks with access. And especially if they know they're going to be in a book, they're not going to hang up on you or whatever. And we had both put out books before, not that they were aware of that, but they just knew we were for real. And we had them. And most of the interviews were on the phone, at least most of mine were. And they were fine, though. They wanted to answer anything that we had to say. They would try, you know.
Yeah.
And a lot of them they just didn't know. Well, I interviewed a lot of people, singers, for another book. And it was the same thing, except Peter Rowan, who could explain anything really well. But there was nobody like this in the book, although interviewing Butch Robbins is going to be a trip, no matter how you look at it. And he said some very interesting and insightful things. But a lot of them, you know, once they got going, you could really ask them. We had a zillion questions. We made up all the questions if you had a full geek interval with them, like down to bridge height, tailpiece type.
It was clear that you had a template, but then also, you know, had some liberty to be following up and whatever.
Well, except for one thing, which is I interviewed John Hartford, and he says, "I want to interview you. Can I do the interview of you?" I'm not going to say no to John Hartford. So, and we were friends, and he just he just did the John Hartford thing on me. You know, I gave him the template, which he somewhat used, but he broke that template just like he was breaking templates for his whole life, you know. And whatever you expected him to do, his point would be, "I'm not going to do that. I'll do something you'll like, but it won't be that."
Yeah,
that's kind of a John Hartford way of approaching things.
We asked him to write liner notes for our first album with my band Skyline, and he said, "Okay." Had nothing to do with the band. We sent him the recording, you know, nothing. He just talked about how he heard Earl Scruggs for the first time and almost drove off the road on his car radio.
That's like when Bill Keith wrote on your first album.
I know.
It was about a parakeet or something.
Yeah, it was all this other stuff. Anyway, but, you know, one thing we're overlooking is one of the really important aspects of this is my friend here who has a PhD in sociology. There at the beginning of the book, there's all this, there's this chart, I guess you'd call it, whatever, of all the people that didn't make it into as main interviewees, but all their information about string height.
And at this point, we're talking about dozens and dozens more.
I could tell the story of that, which was both of us were on the road with our bands at the time, and we were running into each other as well as staying in touch. And we'd say, you know, how are we going to possibly leave out, you name it? The book's going to come out, and he's not going to be in it. Bill Emerson. You know, Eddie Adcock, people that we worshipped, and they weren't going to be in the book because they weren't the originators and all this.
Yeah, for every one person you want to include, there's 10 more who
and it was hard. And we were seeing these people on the road, so I'd feel guilty in anticipation of when they'd see the book that they weren't asked to be in.
But I think part of it was, and speaking about the selection process, we were picking people who were on the scene at that time. This is a snapshot of who was around and out there doing it. In 1988 or whatever.
85 is when we did most of the work on the book.
Okay, was
right
that
around then? Right, you made Hill Country right in the middle of that,
somewhere in there. And so Bill Emerson was in the Country Current Navy band, so he wasn't really at festivals. Eddie Adcock was kind of off the scene.
He was playing with David Allan Coe on some kind of a gizmo that was sort of like a banjo. And he wasn't playing bluegrass, hadn't been in bluegrass for years. So
and Pat Cloud, who was just kind of obscure jazz player who wasn't on the scene, but he put an album out. And he's a jazz player right at this time, so he's in there. And the awkward thing is that we're in there. We're on our own book, which we discussed, and you thought we should be in there because we were very on the scene, and yet. But what about all these other people? So, but, you know, and
speaking
then of course,
Banjo, let's talk about me.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. And so then shortly thereafter, you know, once it comes out, then Bill Emerson's back on the scene and Eddie Adcock's back on the scene and on, you know, so it's a snapshot of that time.
And Larry McNeely's in there too.
Yeah, Larry, who was not, and then he went playing harmonica writing science fiction, you know, he played harmonica with Roy Acuff.
He was the studio banjo player at the time, guy.
Right.
Bobby Thompson, why didn't we have him as one of the main guys? There must have been a reason.
Because he was totally off the scene.
By that time, he had done so
MS
much.
Also at that point.
Yeah, he already had MS. So that was part of deciding the Big 18.
Did you have any disagreements about who the Big 18 should be?
Not that
I think
remember.
I sort of resisted having us in there, but
Yeah, I remember we had that conversation, and I'm thinking, yeah, well, people will raise their eyebrows, but that's not going to keep you out of the book, as far as I'm concerned.
or you. So anyway,
Well,
we
you
went with that.
I knew you deserved to be in the book, and we had reason to be interested in banjo educators. For instance, later we included Murphy Henry, who was not known as a picker, but was an important teacher, and a guy from Europe that I thought was going to become a very big hotshot, Philippe Bourgeois, who has a recording of dueling banjos where he's dressed in, I believe, a clown suit that comes out of Europe, and it has like 500,000 hits the last time I saw it.
Yeah.
And he was a brilliant player, reminded me a lot of Alan Mundy, and I'd met him in Europe a few years before, so he went in the book, and then little Jimmy Henley is in the book because he was on TV with Roy Clark a lot. And here's a guy who wasn't in the book, Sammy Sheeler. Mm-hmm. But I did invite him to be part of this extra group, and he just never answered. He was more of a hippie back then, and he wasn't too, shall we say, on top of the business end. But Scott Vestal, I thought we better get him in because I knew he was going to be big, and he did send in the stuff. So basically, I decided to get busy about this. Tony was doing the bulk of the tablatures. In fact, I didn't think I did any of them, but Tony likes doing transcriptions, and he's good at it, so he was doing that. And then some of the players sent in transcriptions because they had them. But I just thought, well, we just got to include these other people, and if we're going to go to this effort, we've got to include it. So I believe it was 49 extra people we included, and we still had to leave people out who we had a lot of respect for, but they just weren't making records or something like that, so maybe they wouldn't be known. And one of the last people we included was Gene Parker, who is not a household name, but I would see him all the time because he was the regular banjo player in Lost and Found, and he had his own style. He was a really nice guy. He could really play, and he got in the book.
Yeah.
And what I did was I made up a two-sided piece of paper questionnaire because that was one of my specialties as a sociologist. I knew how to ask questions that would get good answers. And we went through the whole bridge height tailpiece.
Yeah.
How many lessons did you take? A lot of information that didn't take that long for them to write, but part of the fun was asking them their advice to new players or to banjo players, and they all had something to say. Dave Evans answered with 3 exclamation points after every sentence because that's the way he was. And Max Wareham recently, he put out a big, wonderful book on Rudy Lyle.
Yeah.
And both Tony and I had seen Rudy Lyle play pretty much when his banjo career was over, but he came out to the early bluegrass festivals a time or two, and we got to see him play. And I thought, well, we've got to include Rudy Lyle. And I got a hold of everybody's address, mailed them, this is pre-internet, of course, mailed them the questionnaire. So Rudy sends back the questionnaire in a very nice handwriting and a very appreciative note. And I photocopied it to give to Max, who wrote this whole book on him, but they weren't even alive at the same time, those two guys. And he was very appreciative. And he noted the date, and he says, Rudy died about a month later.
Wow.
And so we got in by the skin of our teeth on everybody. I don't know anybody that we missed because they died. Joe Medford was mentioned a lot, but I was not even aware of him, and I think I just never came across. But a lot of people mentioned him as an important banjo player in the very early days. And you got to interview Sonny.
Right.
That had to be a trip.
Yeah, I don't remember details because, I've spent so much time with him over the years, just being around Sonny. He's like, that was one of the cases where, as Bill Monroe said, he hit his part. The infinity look. And the Sonny, you ask him one question, he'll talk for 10 minutes, which is great, which is what you want because you can
Makes
edit
your job
it down.
Easier, yeah.
Yeah, or it's all just fascinating, and which it was. He didn't, well, no, never mind. I shouldn't tell it. Yeah, can I tell the story?
You can tell it, and Keith will edit it out if we were going to get in trouble.
It's not in the book, but it's such. Should I tell? It's off topic, but it's a great Sonny story. That he told. I asked him to tell me a second time to make sure I had it right. So Sonny is, I think he was 14 when he was with Monroe. I sort of remember 12, but he said it was 14.
14 is right.
Yeah,
I know
it was
that.
14. And he just got the job with Monroe, and they leave Nashville. It's Jimmy Martin and Sonny and I guess a bass player or something. And no, I'm wrong. It's Charlie Klein on fiddle. And they're heading up in the bluegrass vehicle, what kind of car it was. And they're going along, and they're playing in North Carolina, and probably Charlie Klein's driving or something. And then Monroe says, a little ways along the way, okay, now I want Sonny to drive. And apparently what Sonny said is that Bill wouldn't talk to him because he was a kid. He would talk to Jimmy. And so he said, Jimmy, you tell Sonny he's going to drive now. So Sonny gets behind the wheel, 14 years old, driving the Bluegrass Boys. And I said, Sonny, did you know how to drive? He said, well, we had a farm in Kentucky, near the Ohio border, and I drove a tractor. So he gets behind the wheel, and he's going along. And Monroe says, now we're going to be late. Now, Jimmy, you tell Sonny to put the pedal to the metal, and we're going to get up there the way we want to.
I never heard this. This is great.
And he's going along, and suddenly this cop pulls him over, for speeding. And the cop looks in the window and sees Sonny there, says, son, how old are you? I'm 14 years old, sir. And the guy looks back and sees Bill Monroe, doesn't recognize him, and says, sir, did you know this boy is 14 years old? And Bill says, no, I didn't know that. I did not know that. Well, son, I'm going to take you in. And he arrests Sonny and takes him to jail, wherever this was in southern North Carolina or wherever they were at this point. And Sonny spends most of the day in jail, and Bill says, "Now it's heavy traffic ahead. We got to get it back. We got to get onto the show. Let's go." And they drive off, leaving Sonny alone, 14 years old, in jail.
I never heard this. This
for
is
something
great.
that Bill made him do indirectly. But
And I said,
denied.
Sonny, did you call your parents? He said, no, because then they would have said, you'll never play with Bill Monroe again. So he just kept his mouth shut. And they said at the end of the show, Bill said to Charlie Klein, now, Charlie, you go down there and bail out Sonny. But Sonny spent X number of hours as a 14-year-old kid by himself in jail in some godforsaken, the jail was some godforsaken place.
That didn't get in the book.
That didn't make it in the book, but it's a story that should have made it in the book. Yes.
Yeah, you got to find it out.
Yeah.
Hey folks, Keith here, just taking a quick break from the episode, but I'll be right back with the rest of it. I did just want to mention that if you are looking to have your dream banjo built, or if you just need some of the top quality components to add to a project or an existing banjo, I couldn't recommend anyone more than Sullivan Banjos. Sullivan has been one of the top names in the banjo industry for decades, and Eric Sullivan down in Alabama brings all that experience and adds his personal, customized touch to make sure that you are getting the banjo of your dreams. Whether you are looking for a tried and true traditional design, or if you want to get a bit more imaginative, chances are if you can dream it, Eric can build it. I know that's true because I've been playing my own Sullivan custom banjo since 2004. So give Eric Sullivan at Sullivan Banjos a call at 502-365-5022. Visit them on the web at sullivanbanjo.com or email at sullivanbanjo@gmail.com. Now, once you have that Sullivan Banjo in your hands, the best way to learn it that I recommend is with Peghead Nation's online streaming video courses. You can learn bluegrass, old time, and many other styles from some of the most talented players and instructors in all of roots music. Check out some of these banjo classes that they offer. Beginning Banjo with Bill Evans, Bluegrass Banjo with Bill Evans, Clawhammer Banjo with Evie Layden, Wade Ward Style Banjo with Bruce Molsky, The Banjo According to Danny Barnes, and Contemporary Bluegrass Banjo with Wes Corbett. All of these courses are going to include high-quality multi-angle video lessons, downloadable notation and tablature, play-along tracks, and plenty of songs to play along with. Now, the best part is that just for being a Picky Fingers listener, you are going to get your first month free. Just go to pegheadnation.com and use the promo code PickyFingers, all one word, all lowercase, at checkout. Once again, pegheadnation.com and use the promo code PickyFingers to get your first month free. And folks, another sponsor of the show and one of my favorite places on earth is Elderly Instruments up in Lansing, Michigan. Now, I worked there for about 10 years, and it's still where I go for all my banjo, guitar, and any other string instrument needs, so that should really tell you something. Elderly has been family-owned since 1972 and has grown to become the world's most trusted source for new, used, and vintage fretted instruments. So whether you are looking for your first beginner instrument or that hard-to-find vintage collectible, Elderly is going to have that, and they are also going to back it up with the best customer service in the business. So head over to elderly.com to see their full inventory online. They ship worldwide, by the way. Or give them a call at 517-372-7880.
There was various mysterious Monroe behavior that I just couldn't figure out. And I was friends with Nancy Talbot, who put on a lot of shows and festivals in the Northeast. And she was a pioneer with that, and people would stay at her house. They'd come up from the South and stay at her house. And she kind of caught on to a lot of the culture that most of us Yankee types are not really exposed to, because that culture goes... That's in the back room, and they meet us in the front room, you know. And so she says, well, you just don't try to interview Bill Monroe on the phone. He wants you to come to Nashville in person. And
it's like a respect thing, or is that?
Let's not even try to interpret it. She just said it was the rule. And we could interpret it as we want, and respect is something, but for whatever reason, you just go. And the other interviews that I got with him, I was there in person, and we had plenty of time, you know, which really helped. And in fact, when there was going to be a movie about Bill Monroe's life called "Can't You Hear Me Calling," and it was going to have Jake Gyllenhaal in it, and they hired Ronnie McCoury right away to create all the music. So he got all these great players in the studio. Mm-hmm. And
Michael Daves was in that too.
Who?
Michael
Daves.
Yeah.
Well, so I said, I have all these interviews with Monroe. You want them? He says, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I sent him about 3 hours worth of conversations with me and Monroe. And Ronnie said, I can't believe you asked him all those questions. And he really answered them, you know, because I was asking him about his cattle and what happened in Japan when he went to Japan. He said, well, they treated me as though I was as important as the president of the United States. And of course, if I could do a Monroe imitation, that would be all the better, but I can't. But, and so we're still hero worshipers, you know, whether it's Sonny or J.D. Crowe or John Hartford, any of these. And then they'll take the time to have a full conversation and let us fully geek out on them in every imaginable way. Tony wanted the question, what is the future of the banjo, which we are now living in, because it's 40 years later almost. And it was a sensational thrill to do this. And then let's move on to the next chapters. We had to transcribe all the stupid interviews, which takes forever. Yeah. And then there was the tablature and the photos, and we wanted to have pictures of the right hands and the way they wear their picks. Everything we could think of, full geekery, nothing, no stone unturned.
Yeah, that's a comprehensive
And that
book.
took a lot of follow-up, because we had to find the photographers who'd go meet up with Alan Shelton or somebody and say, I'm taking pictures of you. And you got to hold your hand like this, because I have a diagram that was presented to me, and we want you to hold your hand like this so that you can see all this stuff. So there's a huge amount of detail work. I was on the road a lot with Hot Rise, and this is the year 1985, and yours truly had purchased a new thing called a computer in 1984, and it was one of these computers that had 2 drives in it, but you had to put them in. They were floppy disks, each one holding 20K. And it was a 16-pound thing that I could carry on the Hot Rise bus and could be plugged in, but they had to turn on the generator of the bus, so I had AC power. And I sat there for hours after hours with my little tape recorder and my new computer, my 16-pound computer,
Doing the
and
word
I'm
processing.
typing, and there's photos of me just typing away, transcribing all these interviews, and meanwhile Tony is tabbing his head off.
Transcribing.
And then there's the whole business of, well, who's going to photograph whoever, and it all got done. It was just laborious. It got very laborious after all this fascinating geekery. Now we have to get serious and
turn it in and have it look like something. And in my memory, it took us 3 years, not full time, obviously, because we're on the road, but it was a 3-year process.
Chipping away at it, yeah.
And then I remember some years later, people, maybe, I don't know if Music Sales asked us, but people were talking about, well, there should be a new book out of like this, but like with all the people that are, Bill Emerson's now on the scene, Eddie Adcock's on the scene, Tony Furtado, and of course, later is Noam Pikelny, whatever. But all these great people didn't make it into our book, and I think these 2 or 3 people said, "Oh, we'll do it."
Oh, that was I'll name them, which is Ian Perry and Ned Luberecki.
Right. Were they the ones that were going to do it?
They got in touch with me, and I said, "More power to you.
Power to you. Yeah, exactly.
I'll help you." But then I told them the story. So some of the story, besides all the work, is that it took them 7 years to sell out the first printing of 7,500 copies. So I'll be frank and just say my first book on music sales, or it was Oak Publications, sold over 200,000. So I said, oh, we'll probably sell 200,000 of this book because anybody who buys my instruction book is going to want this book for sure. But they priced it completely so high, $29.95,
which at the time seemed like a lot.
Was very expensive for a book. But it was a big fat 400-page book.
Yeah.
And then what happened was they sent it out to all these music stores, and then people go to the music store and say, "Oh, what a great book," and read it at the music store and thumb it over until it wasn't buyable anymore. And then the store
also not buy it themselves.
And they wouldn't buy it themselves. They just say, well, I hope maybe somebody will give me this or I'll whatever. And so the store wouldn't order anymore. And it took 7 years for them to sell 7,500 copies. And then they informed me they weren't going to print it anymore. So that was a little disappointing.
Yeah.
This big fortune that I thought I was about to acquire just went away, and then it stayed out of print. It was just out of print. Now,
except you could find it on eBay later on for like $250 per. And I mentioned this to Music Sales and said, you should just put it out again, but sell every one of them for $250. And they said, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah.
Well, it kept going like that, and then there's, by this time. Into the 90s. In the late 90s, now there's the internet and banjo discussion groups and whatnot. And Masters of the 5-String comes up quite a bit because it's the authority on 70 banjo players and Bill Monroe's opinion of banjo players. Yeah. There's nothing like it in the banjo world, even though we had both done pretty extensive books. And it was kind of driving me nuts to think that there were all, what few copies people wanted to get rid of were selling in the hundreds of dollars. And so I got in touch with John Lawless, who had done a number of tab books for me and other people. And he was a publisher. He had what was called AccuTab Publications. And I said, John, you're the man to publish this book. And he wasn't exactly leaping up and down about that. So he put out the word that if he could get 500 people to agree to buy the book, he would reprint it if that was possible. And then Dan Early was the guy at Music Sales, really nice guy. And I told him what was in the works. And he says, we have the plates that it's printed from. You can have them, he said. I assumed we were going to have to buy them, but he just wanted us to have them. He says, do what you want with them. And so, hooray, we can. So I got in touch with John Wallace and I said, we won't have to pay for that. But so he puts the book out, except now it's $60, which is, again, prohibitive. Except when we started advertising it, people were buying it, but not all that many. And I think he might have even printed it a second time. But we are now doing this in the month of June 2023, and the very last hard copy has recently been sold. So if you see a hard copy, hold on to it because maybe it'll be worth gajillions of dollars. Except but now all this information is more than 30 years old. It's from the 1980s. Some of it is closer to 40 years old. And most of the people that are really interesting to today's world of bluegrass are not in the book because they're too young, like Noel McKelney. Yeah. We did get Bailey in the book with a nice big fat interview, but everybody else in the book is either dead or old at this point. Except for me and Tony. No, we're only in our
accepting
70s
us.
now.
Oh, that's young. That's right.
So
that's
we're
right.
not that old. But anyway, so John Lawless, thank goodness, still had, I forget whether it was the film or the files. Yeah, he has PDF files of the whole book. And he says, I'll give them to you. So I have them now. So theoretically, we could make a 430-page download.
Yeah, digital version.
In theory. And that's where it lays right now. And like I said, after telling the sad story to Ned and Ian about what we did to create a fortune of 7,500, the sales might have gone as high as 10,000 total, which is considered kind of fairly good, but not especially good for any book. But for the amount of work in it, I believe it comes out to about $1 an hour. But I know, speaking for myself, and I'm guessing for you too, Tony, I wouldn't trade that time for anything, even though I hated all that work sitting on the bus typing away and calling people to say, when are you going to send the photos and all this stuff. And this is all pre-internet when you can't just put it in an email and just send it out to 30 people. It meant phone calls to each person. Yeah. Or you could write them a letter.
And then mailing the photo, right?
So
looking back at the interviews, are there topics that you think were missed opportunities in any way, or that you
I don't remember anything specifically. I mean, I honestly haven't leafed through that book in quite a while. I'm too busy doing other stuff.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Yeah, but I'm sure there were things in there I wish I'd asked. I mean, I interviewed Earl a couple of times in his later years, and why didn't I ask him that? Why didn't I ask him this? And, there's certain things. I mean, there were things that I asked him over the phone. One thing was, why I never asked him, why'd you bring your thumb over to the second string for the second hammer on a Foggy Mountain Breakdown? And he said, because it felt good. Okay. Which I think means if you're going index, middle, fast, it's hard to do that for most people. It's, for me, there's something about that movement that's difficult. And then he said, also because when you're picking with your index finger, it's closer to the bridge, the way his hand falls on the banjo, and the thumb's out ahead of it. So you have a sharper tone with the index and a more mellow tone with the thumb. Plus, it's a metal pick and a plastic thumb pick. And that tonal difference meant something to him.
Wow.
Like, whoa. Playing that tempo.
Yeah, one
You're
note
aware
out
of the
every,
tonal.
There's 11 notes a second when you're listening to his recording of Foggy Mountain Breakdown. So he cares about one of them that takes an 11th of a second, and it's bugging him.
Yeah, and that means something to him. Like, God, this guy's even more of a genius than I realized. Holy cow.
A lot more to it than just it felt good. Once you dig into it.
It's a tonal thing, yeah.
Wow.
Well, I'll get back to a little bit more about Earl, because I have to say I was a friend of his. I got to stay at his house once, and he drove me to the Grand Ole Opry once, and it was just amazing that he accepted me as somebody in his life. I was also very worried about the fact that I had the responsibility of writing the largest essay about the music of Earl Scruggs that would probably ever be written. It's 20 pages long, and it's detailed. My own observations combined with things that he had in his column in Pickin' Magazine. So I wrote all this stuff, and I presented it to him. And now I'm nervous because he might say, no, I don't want to talk about this. He said, oh, it's fine. He said the whole chapter's fine, except two things he wanted changed. Okay, one of them you might be able to guess. The other one you never guess. Because I quoted Don Reno. Don was the guy who owned the banjo that Earl ended up with for life. And Don talked about the trade they had in 1948 for their two banjos. And he said, Earl had the hots for my banjo. Earl said to me, I did not have the hots for his banjo. So I had to take that out. That was okay. And the other one was very sweet. He said, you can't write a chapter about my career without telling that it was all made possible by Louise. And he was very, she meant so much to him. She was really important in his life. I remember hearing him interviewed after she had died, and he said, oh, she was just a great wife, a great mother, a wonderful agent, and he said a great lover, which I thought was kind of cool. And so he really wanted to be able to say something about that. So I put that in, and they were both happy with that. And that's all I needed for permission, and we got to use everything. And to me, that made the book. And then that big chart with all the extra people, almost 50 people. And I did actually take it to a photocopy place, and I made a physical chart that was about 4 foot by 4 foot. Mm-hmm. But when it went into the book, it came out to about 30 pages.
Yeah.
And you get everybody's birthday, you get everybody's bridge height.
Yeah.
Who are their 4 influences from banjo players? Who are their 4 influences from other than banjo players? And then I did an analysis of that. And one of my favorite things about it, and it came later, it got in the next edition of the book, was I approached the difficult section or subject of how many fingers do you plant on the head? Mm-hmm. Out there in banjo podcast land, how many fingers should you put on the head? Is it 2? Earl said you put 2 on the head. Yeah. And I had an argument in print with Jack Hatfield because he says it won't be good if you don't have both fingers on the head. And I had a big discussion with Bill Evans. He said, you got to have 2 fingers on the head. So I polled 40 people, and I found out a third of them don't put 2 fingers on the head. And then my line became, somebody has to explain to Sammy Sheeler that he's not very solid, but if he put a second finger on the head, he'd become a solid banjo player. And Alison Brown, she could really improve her playing, That issue is dead now, as far as I'm concerned. It was like you got to have 2 fingers on the head, and now it's common knowledge that you don't.
I asked Earl about it one time, and he said that when he was a kid, he was playing already, he was a teenager, whatever. I think it was Junie, his brother Junie, was met this guy from Virginia who was a banjo picker who happened to be in their area. And Junie said, oh, yeah, my brother Earl plays. I should get you 2 together. So Junie brings the guy over to the house, and Earl watches him play. Earl told me this. And he had his pinky planted, but his ring finger went with the middle finger, as the muscles of one's hand will do for some folks. And he was great. And so I said, so does this mean, does it matter if you have 1 or 2 fingers on the head? He said, no, it doesn't matter. Whatever works.
But in his book, he says 2 fingers.
Did he say that?
It's in his book. I'll just
leave it at that. Did he say that? We don't know
I
that.
Won't ever know that.
Well, years later, he said it doesn't matter, so I'm going to stick with that.
So I'll tell Jack Hatfield that, and just I love Jack Hatfield. So there we really had it out over that issue back and forth until Hub Nitchie said, "Take it outside, boys." But that's just some of the things. So we end up remembering a lot of what was said, which makes us a better informed couple of banjo guys who teach, both of us teach and write books and things. And I'm glad to have that there. And I'm also glad that in some cases it gave a boost to the players who got in the book. There are still people like Richard Bailey, who is very grateful that he got in the book. And he deserved to be in the book, but he was kind of unknown at the time. We just knew he was good. And so it was a pleasure to be able to help people in that way. But I'd see Billy Ray Latham. He's not in the book. I hope he still likes me. He was very nice to me, thank goodness. But then an unnamed guy from California roasted me for not putting him in the book, and he wasn't even close. He had hardly ever made a record, but he thought he was important enough to be in the book. It wasn't Peter Schwimmer, I should mention, who was good enough to be in the book, but he wasn't making records. Yeah. And Peter never complained. But this other guy, who I shouldn't name, really, he wouldn't talk to me.
Is he the only one you can remember ever confronting you about?
In particular, a wife of one of the players who got in the book but wasn't one of the featured 18. Would continue. She had a newsletter and would continually mention that what a shame it was that Eddie was not given full attention in the book, time after time. And I was friendly with both her and the banjo player husband. And I explained it as well as I could. You know, he was playing with David Allen Coe. Oh, I guess I gave it away. Sorry.
You already said his name, too.
Yeah. Well, I did already. Okay. Well, anyway, and I think Martha is a great person, and she is such a great supporter of Eddie, and I think Eddie is a prince. He's a wonderful player and person. And there was no insult of any kind intended, but I had to keep seeing her newsletter saying, unfortunately, now she has people writing into me complaining about him not being in the book. With Bill Emerson, I never got a complaint, but we had a chance to substitute. We needed a full-page photo, so they had somebody ready to go who I didn't think was that significant. I said, let's put a full-page photo of Bill Emerson in this book. So they did. That made me feel better because Bill Emerson, it would have been in the book had he been active at the time on the scene.
Sure.
And, now we have 40 years of banjo players who have stood on those guys' shoulders.
Absolutely.
And made a gigantic difference. And we've had we talked about the future of the banjo, and nobody said, well, all these people, Noam McKelney is part of the future. Who's that? How do you spell his name? And I don't know, who's that guy, Rex, who plays, he has a funny tuning.
Rex McGee. Yeah, he has like a fourth tuning.
And we're not even talking about the clawhammer geniuses that are all over the place. So,
and now Nikolai Margolis, who's incredible.
And
at 15.
There's a kid that I know from North Carolina named Ettore Bazzini, and he's already made a record at the age of 15. And you should hear him play Farewell Blues like, hello? He's 15.
I'll check it out. I haven't heard of him.
He just put out a record on Patuxent. And he also sings and writes songs and plays guitar and is into all kinds of styles. But he's a solid, down-to-earth banjo picker who cares more about bluegrass than anything else. And his parents are like, what do we do? What do we do? And he's a great kid. He's real easy to be around, but he's going to be on the scene. And he's been renamed because his name is Ettore Bazzini, because his father is from another country, and they name people like that. But they've renamed him on the record as Eddie Ray, as though his last name is Ray and his first name is Eddie. Okay. But his real name is Ettore Bazzini. I just think it's a brilliant thing that what Earl Scruggs started in his little humble home when he was 9 years old blew up to this very, very important kind of music that is branded as American music, although there's incredible players in Japan and Finland and Australia. It's all really inspiring, and we took a good snapshot of the whole scene as it was when it was only 40 years old. Now it's closer to 80 years old. And it's going to get bigger and bigger and more amazing people. What you're doing is part of what's making it grow. There was nothing like you doing what you're doing out at the time.
Yeah, I don't have a page limit or anything. I don't need to draw the line after 18 people. I can include whoever I want.
But you don't have any photographs on your...
There's some shortcomings. There's some advantages and some disadvantages.
And the tabs, of course.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thanks for being interested in this.
Of course.
It's one of the things I'm proudest of in my whole life, really, that we got to do this book.
Do either of you feel like it changed your playing at all? Do you remember taking anything to heart as in terms of revelations?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it enriched my playing, just transcribing all those tunes on some level that'd be hard to quantify. But, transcribing Ralph Stanley or Bela or Earl or, Sonny, JD, whatever. I'm sure some of that got in there on some level, as any transcriptions I've done over the years has, but nothing I could pinpoint and say, well, from point A to point B, now I'm doing this that I wasn't doing before, on a more subtle level, but it certainly on some level enriched my playing.
Yeah.
Well, for me, part of my joy and involvement in bluegrass is the people involved. So some of what really stuck with me the most was what people said in the interviews. Mm-hmm. So I'll throw out one more little gem, which is how J.D. Crowe learned to play. He was already into guitar, but Flatt and Scruggs had the radio show right in Lexington where he was growing up. So his dad would bring him down to the radio station and put him in the front row, right sitting in front of Earl for about a year when this happened. And he kept seeing this. And I said, well, do you ever talk to him? He said, no, I was too scared. I said, well, one time I did talk to him. I said, well, what did you say to Earl? And he said, I believe this is a precise quote. How do you make it sound like your notes is a mile apart from each other? Which is JD's way of saying he became very fond of the word separation as an important characteristic of good banjo playing. Yeah. In other words, the individualization of each note. And I said, well, what did he say? And he said, I don't know, which is a typical Earl answer. And then he said, well, he said, and this is a gem, really, I think he says, I just try to make every note count. And when I teach, if I hear somebody kind of mumbling through a note on the second string or the fifth string, I tell them, see if you can make every note count, which means there has to be an individual. You're not just rolling your fingers along the way you would on your knee. You're individually picking each string. Each string is going to have something come up to it and bang it hard and really cause it to go bang, I call it a happy explosion. Anyway, so that was just remembering that he said that. And then Alan Shelton says, my dad said my hand looked like a big spider crawling across the floor, because Alan was not one of these people like Earl who kept his fingers very close to the strings. If you watched him play, he would reach way out with his right hand and then come back and hit the string. Well, it didn't hurt his timing or his sound one bit, but it pops some myths. The myth of the two fingers on the head, it's gone. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's gone. I hope it's gone. And, you have to do this because Earl did this. You have to own a pre-war flathead master tone. Well, we found out everybody's banjo, and the minority of them were pre-war flatheads. You have to do this. You have to do that. No, you don't. Look at all these people who do it different ways. And that was a big motivation for me to even do the book in the first place, because I was around people who were quoting all these myths as though they were true, because they heard one person do it and they figured, well, he's a pro, he knows better than anybody. And I didn't want that to stand. I'm too much into accuracy.
One of my favorite aspects is the question of what album or recording best exemplifies your banjo playing. And again, it's a snapshot. A lot of them recorded many things after that question. But for someone like me who got this soon after I started playing and felt like I need to figure out who all these people are and what they sound like, that was a shopping list that I could go to. So yeah, real thorough and really useful all the way around.
Yeah, I like that. What record best represents your playing was a good question. But of course now those records, none of them exist. But if they said the name of a tune, you could find that on Spotify. But, Walter Hensley's old time favorites, you say, where is that? It might be in a used record store, but it won't be available on the internet.
Yeah, we could go off about that. There's some YouTube channels that are pretty good for out of print stuff, but yeah, that's a digression. Well, I've taken enough of both your time. I can't thank you enough for putting in all the work, however many years ago about the book, but of course with me here today too. It's been fun hearing the stories and everything. So, everyone go, I don't know, who should they email saying that they demand the reprint?
If they write to my website, or, they could write to office@letspick.org, or just, I'll give my email with that, Pete@drbanjo.com, drbanjo.com. and we'll just keep a file of those people and try to sell them something else. But if the book ever does become a download, we do that. But
all right. Thanks again, you guys.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Keith.
it. Enjoy the rest of your
Appreciate it.
weekends.
thank you so much.
Thank you once again for tuning in to the Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast. Extra special thanks to listener Fred Kinch. He's today's VIP supporter of the show. Head over to patreon.com/banjo podcast to support the show yourself and earn excellent prizes in exchange. Don't forget to take advantage of the clearance sale over at banjopodcast.com. You can get all of your items for 23% off. That's those Picky Fingers shirts, stickers, and music by entering Summer23 as a coupon code at checkout, and that is now through the end of August. As always, you can email the show at pickyfingersbanjopodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you all next time.